Some questions never go away, not because we haven't looked hard enough, not because the books are missing or the records were lost, but because even after all the documents have been read, some questions just stay open. Tonight we're going to sit with those questions together. Questions from the Second World War that history has never fully answered. We're not here to solve them. We're here because understanding what we don't know actually helps us understand the war itself. The blank spaces in history matter just as much as the parts we do know. These unanswered questions shaped how survivors lived. The not knowing followed them home. The wondering never stopped. For many people, the absence of answers was its own kind of pain. As you settle in tonight, know this. These are old questions asked by people long ago. You don't need to carry their wondering, but listening to their questions helps us understand them and the impossible world they were trying to survive. Fact number 1. What Adolf Hitler actually believed, deep down, privately, away from the cameras and the crowds, is still one of the biggest unsolved mysteries of the entire 20th century. The best biography ever written about him by a historian named Ian Kershaw is very careful to point out the difference between what Hitler said and what Hitler actually felt inside. And Kershaw is equally honest that we may never know the full answer, because almost everything we have is a record of Hitler performing for an audience, not speaking from his heart. Here is the real puzzle. His beliefs were so consistent, so constant, across so many years and so many different situations that it becomes almost impossible to find the private person hiding behind the public one. Did his deep hatred of Jewish people come first and then shape his political career? Or did the political career take a loose collection of ugly prejudices and hammer them, through repetition and power, into something that eventually became impossible to separate from genuine belief? This question matters more than it might seem, because the answer changes how we understand the relationship between ideas and catastrophe. Did the Holocaust require a man who truly believed what he was saying, or just a man willing to act as though he did? And does the difference between those two things even matter when the consequences were identical? 80 years later, we still can't fully answer that. Fact number 2. No one has ever found a written order from Hitler telling his people to carry out the Holocaust. Not a single document. Historians have spent decades trying to explain this gap. The most reasonable explanations are that Hitler gave instructions by speaking rather than writing, that records were deliberately destroyed, and that the whole system ran on a kind of understood intention. People knew what was wanted without being told in writing. All of these explanations make sense. None of them is fully satisfying. The deeper debate is about a specific moment, the exact point when the Nazi regime crossed from persecuting Jewish people and forcing them to leave, into systematically murdering them. When was that decision made? Who made it? Was it one clear decision, or was it dozens of smaller decisions that slowly added up to something monstrous without anyone ever saying the words out loud? Two of the most respected Holocaust historians, Christopher Browning and Raoul Hilberg, have studied this question their entire careers. They mostly agree on the broad picture, but differ in the details, and those details matter enormously for understanding how genocide actually happens. And if we understand how it happens, maybe we can recognize it sooner next time. The paperwork of the Holocaust is vast, but the specific moment of decision, the interior of that choice, remains unrecovered. Fact number 3. Sometime in the spring and summer of 1942, the Allied governments in London and Washington started receiving information that was deeply disturbing. The deportations happening across Europe, the trains full of Jewish men, women and children, were not resettlement operations as the Germans claimed. They were systematic murder. This information came from multiple directions: Polish underground couriers, decoded German communications, individual survivors who had escaped and made it to safety with their stories. By the time the information reached desks in London and Washington, it was specific enough that the innocent explanations were no longer believable. What happened next is a question that historians including Martin Gilbert and David Wyman have studied with great seriousness and great sorrow. By mid-1944, Allied planes were flying regular missions over the region where Auschwitz was located. Bombing the railway lines that carried people to the camp was technically possible. It was never ordered. The reasons given at the time: military priorities, uncertainty about effectiveness, the distance between intelligence officers and operational commanders, have been examined carefully and found partly convincing and partly not convincing at all. What fills the remaining gap between partly convincing and fully adequate is a question the surviving record cannot close, and the moral weight of that gap has not gotten lighter with time. Fact number 4. On August 6, 1945, an American plane called the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. The standard story connects these events simply: the bombs caused the surrender, but historians have been quietly debating whether that simple story is actually true. Did the bombs cause the surrender? Or was it the Soviet Union entering the war against Japan on August 8 that truly broke Japan's resistance? Or had Japanese leaders already been quietly looking for a way out and simply needed something to point to that would let them surrender without losing face? A historian named Gar Alperovitz argued decades ago that the bombs were also partly meant to send a message to the Soviet Union, a demonstration of American power as the post-war world was taking shape. That argument has been challenged, refined, and partially supported ever since without being definitively settled. And there's another question underneath all of this. A surrender that kept the emperor in place, which is what Japan eventually got anyway, could potentially have been negotiated before the bombs. Why wasn't it offered sooner? The answers available in the documents don't fully match the explanations American officials gave at the time. 80 years later, whether the bombs were truly the only way to end the war remains a genuinely open question. Fact number 5. On the night of May 10, 1941, a man named Rudolf Hess, one of the most senior figures in Nazi Germany, climbed into a plane alone and flew to Scotland. He parachuted into a field near Glasgow carrying peace proposals and asked to meet a British nobleman named the Duke of Hamilton. He was immediately captured, spent the rest of his very long life in prison, and died in Spandau in 1987 at the age of 93. What was he actually trying to do? Who in Britain did he believe was ready to receive him? And the biggest question of all, did Hitler know about this mission before it happened, or was he genuinely as shocked as he claimed? Every available tool of historical investigation has been pointed at these questions. They have not been answered. The British government handled Hess's arrival with unusual care, suggesting that what he had to say, and the names of the British contacts he believed were sympathetic to him, were sensitive on multiple sides. Documents that might have resolved things stayed classified for decades longer than normal. When they were finally partially released, they raised more questions than they answered. Hess himself, asked repeatedly across 46 years of imprisonment, gave accounts that contradicted each other, were sometimes possibly confused or delusional, and were never complete. The mission in its full meaning has never been explained. Fact number 6. In the autumn of 1941, the German army stood within striking distance of Moscow, and then it didn't take it. Whether it could have weather pushing toward Moscow in August instead of diverting south toward Kiev would have captured the Soviet capital before the brutal Russian winter arrived, is one of the most debated what-if questions in all of military history. Hitler's order to go south toward Kiev has survived. What hasn't survived is the full picture of why that decision was made. What did German intelligence actually know about Soviet strength at the time? What did the supply projections really show? What drove Hitler to insist on the southern route even when several of his top commanders objected strongly? Partial records exist. Diaries and operational documents give us pieces of the picture. But what they can't give us is the full interior of the decision, the specific weight Hitler gave to ideology versus military logic, the degree to which wishful thinking about a rapid Soviet collapse had already infected German planning, and whether the people making the decision understood, in the moment, that they might be making the critical error of the entire war. The decision that looks, from the outside and with the benefit of hindsight, like the turning point of the Eastern Front, remains imperfectly understood from the inside. Fact number 7. Before a single Japanese aircraft left its carrier on the morning of December 7, 1941, Admiral Yamamoto, the man who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, is reported to have said something close to, "This attack will awaken a sleeping giant and produce consequences Japan cannot survive." The exact words vary by source, but what doesn't vary is that his documented pre-war assessments of American industrial capacity were clear. Japan could not win a long war against the United States. So here is the question that has never been fully answered. How does a military and political system, whose senior leaders privately understood the strategic impossibility of what they were doing, go ahead and do it anyway? The factors are all documented. The organizational culture of the Japanese military, the political pressures of that specific moment, the ideology of decisive battle that Japanese naval doctrine was built around, the oil embargo that made the situation feel like a now or never crisis. All of these are real and all are relevant, but they don't add up. Not fully, not satisfyingly, to an explanation of how rational people who understood the probable consequences of their actions committed their entire nation to a course they privately knew was likely to end in catastrophe. That gap between understanding and doing is one of history's most genuinely troubling questions. Fact number 8. On October 14, 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Germany's most famous general celebrated by both sides for his conduct in North Africa, took cyanide in the back of a car near his home in Germany. He had been given a choice by two SS officers who arrived at his door: face a public trial for involvement in the plot to assassinate Hitler, or die quietly with guarantees that his family would be protected. He chose the quiet death. Whether Rommel was genuinely part of the conspiracy is a question the evidence doesn't settle. He had clearly expressed sympathy with the plotters' goals. He had conversations with at least one conspirator, but whether that made him an active participant or simply a man who wanted the war to end and had said so to the wrong people remains unclear. The regime's decision to eliminate him rather than put him on trial is interesting. It might mean they believed he was deeply involved, or it might mean they calculated that publicly accusing Germany's most beloved general of treason would cost them more than a quiet death would. In his final hours, Rommel told his son that he had known the war was lost and had said so, but denied being part of the specific assassination plan. Was that the truth? A version of the truth shaped by the circumstances, a deliberate construction designed to protect his family? The evidence cannot tell us. Fact number 9. Between June 1941 and the D-Day landings in June 1944, the Soviet Union carried the overwhelming weight of the land war in Europe. Tens of millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians died in those 3 years. The question of why Britain didn't commit to a cross-channel invasion earlier has been debated ever since, and two very different readings of the same events exist side by side. British historians have generally explained Churchill's caution as genuine military judgment, the deep, painful memory of the catastrophic frontal assaults of the First World War making him unwilling to attempt a major crossing before the conditions were right. Soviet and some American historians have read the same decisions differently, suggesting that the Mediterranean strategy and the repeated delays reflected a preference for letting Germany and the Soviet Union exhaust each other before committing British and American forces. The conference transcripts, the strategic memos, the private letters, they support both readings at different moments and don't cleanly resolve which consideration was truly primary for which decision makers at which times. What can't be recovered is the full interior of Churchill's strategic thinking across 3 years of decisions, the specific balance between military caution, political calculation, and the specific fear of catastrophic failure that Gallipoli had left permanently inside him. The gap between the documentary record and that interior is wide enough to have kept the debate alive for 80 years. Fact number 10. In 1995, an exhibition called Crimes of the Wehrmacht opened in Hamburg and it changed Germany. The exhibition documented carefully and specifically the participation of ordinary German soldiers, not SS units, not special forces, but regular army troops, in atrocities on the Eastern Front. The reaction was extraordinary. The exhibition was attacked by some, defended by others, revised after some specific attributions were found to be in error, and ultimately confirmed in its central argument by the revised version. What the exhibition could not do, what no historical account has been able to do, was answer the personal question it raised. It documented organizational behavior. What it couldn't reach was the individual level, where on the continuum from direct participation to passive witness to genuine ignorance did any specific soldier stand, and what choices, if any, were actually available to him. The post-war story of the Wehrmacht as a professional army that fought a clean war separate from the SS and its crimes has been thoroughly dismantled. But what hasn't been constructed in its place is a careful individual accounting, an assessment of who knew what, who chose what, and what genuine alternatives existed for the people inside the machine. The organizational evidence is solid. The individual moral picture remains, in most cases, irrecoverable. Fact number 11. Somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of Nazi Germany, a decision was made to include children in the deportations to the extermination camps. This decision was never announced. There is no memo, no conference record, no specific directive that historians have been able to locate and date precisely that said, the children too. The decision's existence is known entirely through its consequences, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of children, which are among the most thoroughly documented facts of the entire Holocaust. The historian Christopher Browning, who has studied the Holocaust's administrative history with forensic care, identifies a period of escalation in the summer and autumn of 1941, during which the definition of who was to be killed expanded progressively. But the specific moment when children became explicit targets, who authorized that expansion, in what form the authorization was communicated to the units carrying it out, is not recoverable from the surviving documents with the precision the question demands. This gap is not accidental. The regime that conducted the killing also managed its own paper trail with considerable care. The most damning decisions are precisely the ones whose documentation is most incomplete. It is a deliberate darkness in the historical record, and it sits at the center of the Holocaust's most morally unbearable territory. Fact number 12. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich with a signed agreement and declared there would be peace for our time. History has treated those words and that moment with a fairly consistent contempt. But what history has treated less consistently is what was actually going on inside Chamberlain's thinking. Did he genuinely believe Hitler's assurances? Did he truly think that giving Germany what it wanted in Czechoslovakia would satisfy it and prevent war? That is the conventional reading. A man who misjudged the situation, whose sincere belief in negotiated peace led him to a catastrophic failure of judgment. But there is a revisionist reading with real documentary support. In this version, Chamberlain knew war was probably coming and used the Munich Agreement to buy Britain a year of rearmament it badly needed before the confrontation would arrive. In this reading, the peace for our time was not naive belief but strategic performance. Both readings have documentary support. Neither has been definitively proven or disproven. What cannot be recovered is the specific interior of Chamberlain's belief in September 1938, whether the man holding that piece of paper in the London Light knew, somewhere he wasn't willing to say publicly, exactly what it was worth. Fact number 13. Raoul Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat who arrived in Budapest in July 1944 with one mission: to protect Hungarian Jews from being deported and murdered. He issued tens of thousands of protective documents. He is credited by the most conservative estimates with saving the lives of tens of thousands of people. He was one of the most effective individual actors of rescue in the entire war. He was arrested by Soviet forces in January 1945, and no one outside the Soviet prison system ever saw him again. The Soviet government first denied knowing anything about him, then admitted he had died in Lubyanka prison in 1947. Then qualified that account in ways that opened the question back up rather than closing it. Survivors of the Soviet Gulag who claimed to have encountered him in subsequent years gave accounts ranging from possibly credible to almost certainly false, without enough verification to settle anything. The Swedish government's handling of his case, how hard it pressed and why it didn't press harder, has been a source of questions that the release of Swedish diplomatic archives has illuminated without resolving. Whether Wallenberg died in 1947, survived longer in Soviet custody, or survived to a later date, remains unanswered after 8 decades of investigation. His family and researchers have pursued it persistently. The ground they can stand on securely has not expanded as much as the effort deserves. Fact number 14. In August 1944, Allied forces in France had an opportunity to close a trap around retreating German forces in a place called the Falaise Pocket. The trap wasn't completely closed. An estimated 40,000 to 50,000 German soldiers escaped through the gap. Those soldiers subsequently fought in the defense of Germany and prolonged the war by months whose cost in lives was considerable. Why wasn't the gap closed? The explanations are multiple. Montgomery being too cautious, Bradley misreading the situation, Patton being halted on orders he disputed, the genuine difficulty of coordinating rapidly advancing forces from different national commands in a fast-moving tactical situation. Every one of these explanations has documentary support. Every one has also been challenged. What the scholarship hasn't produced is a single account that all serious students of the Normandy campaign find fully convincing. An account that explains not just what happened but why the specific individuals in the specific positions made the specific choices they made in the specific hours when the pocket could have been closed and wasn't. The men who made those decisions are gone. The documents record what was decided. The full story of why remains beyond reach. Fact number 15. On the night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, the night known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, organized violence against Jewish businesses, synagogues and people began spreading across Germany. At some point that night, it crossed from organized pogrom into something more widespread, as people who had received no specific instructions joined in, or stood and watched, or quietly helped their Jewish neighbors. The historian Daniel Goldhagen argued in his controversial book that the participation reflected a deeply embedded German cultural hatred of Jewish people, something so widespread that it needed little organized instruction. Other historians argued that the explanation was more situational: peer pressure, organizational context, the specific charged atmosphere of that particular night, rather than pre-existing ideology. The debate between these positions has been sustained by the evidence without being resolved by it. What happened that night is documented in considerable detail. Why it happened, specifically what was in the minds of the people who chose to participate, who watched, who helped, who walked away, is distributed across thousands of individual inner lives that history cannot fully access. The distance of 85 years has made that recovery permanently less possible than it was when the witnesses were still alive. Fact number 16. Captain William Fisk was the first American to die fighting in British service in the Second World War. His Hurricane crashed at Tangmere on August 16, 1940, during the Battle of Britain. He is commemorated in St. Paul's Cathedral in London. What is less widely known is that the exact cause of his crash, whether he was brought down by enemy fire, by mechanical failure, or by something else, was never definitively established. The combat records from that day were incomplete, as Battle of Britain records frequently were in the chaos of those weeks. This is in the context of a war that produced questions of vastly greater consequence, a minor historical puzzle, but it stands for something much larger. Millions of families around the world carried versions of this same question. The specific circumstances of a specific death, important to specific people, lost in the operational confusion of a specific day and impossible to fully reconstruct. Very few families ever received answers that truly closed it. The specific and the personal were often the first things history lost. Fact number 17. Josef Mengele conducted horrific medical experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz. He fled as Soviet forces approached in January 1945, survived in Europe under various identities, emigrated to South America in 1949, lived openly in Argentina for years, and moved as Israeli intelligence intensified its pursuit of Nazi war criminals after capturing Adolf Eichmann in 1960. He died by drowning at a beach in Brazil in 1979. His remains were identified in 1985 through forensic and DNA analysis, and most forensic authorities accept that identification is conclusive. Not everyone does. The doubt that lingers attaches specifically to deaths that happened without witnesses and without the official documentation that a formal trial would have provided. But beyond the question of whether the right man died at that beach lies a larger question. How did Mengele avoid capture for 34 years? What specific individuals and organizations helped him? What did the full network of post-war Nazi protection actually look like in its operational detail? Some answers exist. The complete picture, who helped whom, with what knowledge, through which institutions, is a question whose full answer the available documentation has not provided and may never provide. Fact number 18. Would the Soviet Union have survived the German invasion without the Lend-Lease assistance provided by the United States? The trucks, the food, the raw materials, the communications equipment that flowed through dangerous Arctic convoys and the Persian corridor. Soviet public history said yes, absolutely we would have survived. Western history generally said no, the assistance was essential. The actual evidence taken seriously refuses to answer cleanly in either direction. Nikita Khrushchev, in private memoirs, acknowledged that Lend-Lease had been essential to Soviet survival, a remark Western historians often cite as a corrective to the Soviet public position. But whether essential means the difference between survival and collapse, or simply means that survival was significantly less costly, is a distinction the evidence supports discussing but not resolving. The counterfactual, a Soviet Union fighting without any Lend-Lease support, cannot be tested. The specific contributions of specific supplies to specific operations at specific moments are documented in ways that genuinely support multiple assessments of their overall significance. The question of what won the war on the Eastern Front, and how to divide the credit between Soviet sacrifice, Soviet industrial output, and Western material support, remains genuinely contested among historians who have access to the same evidence and reach different conclusions from it. Fact number 19. On July 20, 1944, a briefcase containing a bomb was placed under a table at Hitler's military headquarters by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. The bomb exploded. Hitler survived. The briefcase had been moved slightly away from him before it went off, and the above-ground building dispersed the blast in a way an underground bunker wouldn't have. The mechanical reasons for the failure are partly documented, but the more important question isn't mechanical. It's this: what would have happened if the bomb had worked? Did the conspirators have enough military support to hold the government together after Hitler's death? Would the German military and civilian population have accepted a negotiated peace from a new government? And crucially, would the Allies, committed to unconditional surrender since the Casablanca Conference, have offered any terms to a German government that didn't include complete military defeat? These questions can't be answered because the history they describe didn't happen. The honest answer to each of them is a careful assessment of probabilities that serious historians disagree about. What is agreed upon? The resistance was real, it was serious, it was sustained at enormous personal cost, and its failure was not predetermined from the beginning. Beyond that, the honest answer is a careful and permanent uncertainty. Fact number 20. In the weeks before June 22, 1941, the evidence pointing toward an imminent German invasion of the Soviet Union was overwhelming. Winston Churchill sent a warning. Soviet intelligence sources inside Germany sent warnings. German deserters who crossed the Soviet border in the final days before the invasion told Soviet officers explicitly what was coming. The observable buildup of German forces along the border was visible to anyone who looked. Fact number 21. On the evening of December 6, 1941, American signals intelligence intercepted and decoded a message from the Japanese Foreign Ministry to its embassy in Washington. It was the final part of a 14-part message breaking off diplomatic negotiations, and it was decoded before it even reached the Japanese ambassador. At least one senior intelligence officer recognized what it meant. A Japanese military action was imminent. What happened between that recognition and the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 hours later has generated more official investigation than almost any other single intelligence failure in American history. 8 separate official inquiries have examined the question. Their findings overlap in some respects and contradict each other in others. The investigations themselves became, over time, part of what required explanation. The gap between the intercepted warning and the unprepared base at Pearl Harbor is one of history's most studied failures, and still one of its least definitively explained. Fact number 22. In the final weeks of the war, as Germany collapsed around him, Heinrich Himmler, the man who had administered the Holocaust, began holding secret meetings. He met with a representative of the World Jewish Congress named Norbert Masuer. He met with Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross. He offered various forms of a separate peace with the Western Allies, including in some versions the release of concentration camp prisoners. What was actually going on inside Himmler in those weeks? Was this a genuine change of position? A cynical last attempt at personal survival through the appearance of moderation? Something psychologically more complicated? A man who had been the architect of systematic genocide attempting to reposition himself in the final moments as a humanitarian? Masuer's account of their meeting in the early hours of April 21, 1945, describes a man who spoke about Jewish people with a combination of self-justification and an apparent desire for acknowledgement that Masuer found deeply disorienting. What Himmler actually believed in those final weeks, about what he had done, about what he hoped for, about who he was, is not recoverable from the surviving record. It may not have been fully accessible to Himmler himself. Fact number 23. Martin Bormann was Hitler's private secretary and one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi regime's final years. After the war, his fate was officially uncertain for 3 decades. He was tried in absentia at Nuremberg and sentenced to death. Reported sightings of him in South America circulated for years. His remains were finally found during construction work in Berlin in 1972, and DNA analysis in 1998 confirmed the identification with high scientific certainty. The bones confirmed where he died and approximately when. What they couldn't confirm was the specific sequence of events between his departure from Hitler's bunker on the night of May 1st to 2nd, 1945, and his death. Was he killed by Soviet fire? Did he take his own life? Was he alone or with others? The witnesses to that night gave accounts that contradicted each other and contradicted the physical evidence in ways the DNA confirmation didn't resolve. The confirmed death closed the question of whether he had survived. It left open, as confirmed deaths sometimes do, the question of exactly how, and the final hours of one of the Nazi regime's most powerful and least examined figures remain a reconstruction from evidence that doesn't quite add up to a complete picture. Fact number 24. When Germany occupied the Netherlands, Dutch civil authorities cooperated with German demands for detailed registration of the Jewish population and did so more completely and efficiently than equivalent administrations in Belgium or France. This cooperation materially assisted the subsequent deportations. The proportion of Dutch Jews who died in the Holocaust was among the highest of any Western European country. Why? Dutch historians have been examining this question with increasing candor since the 1970s. Researchers like Bob Moore and others have produced comparative analyses identifying specific institutional and organizational factors that distinguish the Dutch case from comparable occupied countries. The general picture is fairly clear. What those analyses cannot recover is the specific reasoning of the specific officials who processed the specific registrations, the interior of the compliance, whether they understood what they were facilitating, whether alternative courses of action were genuinely considered and rejected, what precise mixture of institutional habit, personal calculation, and failure of moral imagination produced an outcome whose consequences were so catastrophic. The general explanation is available. The full particular explanation is not. Fact number 25. Before Stalingrad, before El Alamein, before the full weight of American industrial power entered the war, there was a window, roughly the 18 months between the fall of France in June 1940 and the German declaration of war on the United States in December 1941, when a German victory was a genuine possibility, not merely a hypothetical. What would have happened to occupied territories, to the remaining Jewish populations of unoccupied Europe, to Britain under a negotiated peace or successful invasion, and to the entire shape of the 20th century if Germany had consolidated its position during that window? This is a question serious historians approach with great caution, precisely because its emotional and political weight is so large it can distort the care it requires. The historian Richard Evans has examined Nazi planning documents for an occupied Britain with sufficient detail to sketch what German administration might have looked like. What those documents cannot provide is the full developmental trajectory of a Nazi Europe stabilized into a permanent order, how it would have evolved, whether its internal contradictions would eventually have destroyed it, what the human cost of its continuation would have been. The question is unanswerable by definition. Its unanswerability does not make it unimportant. Fact number 26. Japan's Emperor Hirohito occupied a unique position in the Pacific War, officially a divine constitutional monarch, but practically something far more ambiguous. The debate over his specific knowledge of, and responsibility for, the atrocities committed by Japanese forces across the Pacific has been conducted across decades with considerable passion and considerable documentary evidence on both sides. The historian Herbert Bix, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, argued for a substantially more active and responsible Hirohito than the post-war narrative of a passive constitutional monarch required. Counter-arguments have been made with equal scholarly seriousness. Both positions have real documentary support. Both have real limitations. What the debate cannot resolve, because the sources that would resolve it were systematically destroyed in the days between surrender and American arrival, is the specific record of what was said and decided in the imperial conferences where the most consequential decisions were made. The emperor's specific interventions, his specific knowledge, the specific relationship between his authority and the decisions made in his name. The most important documents were gone before the occupation forces arrived to ask for them. Fact number 27. During the German occupation of France, a small village in the mountains called Le Chambon-sur-Lignon did something extraordinary. Its community sheltered thousands of Jewish refugees at significant personal risk throughout the occupation. Philip Halley's account and a documentary film by Pierre Sauvage have both told this story beautifully, explaining the village's behavior through its Huguenot Protestant heritage and the specific moral leadership of its pastors, André Trocmé and Edouard Theiss. But here is what neither account fully explains: why this particular community with this particular heritage in this particular place produced this response, when other communities with comparable religious traditions and comparable leadership did not. The Huguenot heritage was real and relevant. The leadership of Trocmé and Theiss was clearly significant, but the same heritage and similar leadership existed elsewhere without producing comparable results. This means the explanation is incomplete. There is something in the specific configuration of this community at this specific moment that the available explanatory frameworks haven't fully captured. The full account of why ordinary people do extraordinary things in specific circumstances remains, even with Le Chambon's extraordinary documentation, an open question. Fact number 28. When Japan attacked the Philippines in December 1941, General Douglas MacArthur chose to defend the islands rather than immediately withdrawing American and Filipino forces to more defensible positions. The decision resulted in the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, the Bataan Death March, and the imprisonment of tens of thousands of soldiers in conditions that killed a significant proportion of them. Was this a genuine military assessment, a personal investment from a man who had spent years in the Philippines as a military advisor, an underestimation of Japanese capabilities, some combination of professional judgment and personal psychology that the available evidence can't cleanly separate? MacArthur's own account was self-justifying, as such accounts almost always are. D. Clayton James's 3-volume biography, the most comprehensive ever written about him, is careful to document what was decided without being able to fully reconstruct the interior reasoning behind the decisions. In MacArthur's case, the gap between the documented decision and its full rationale is widened by the specific quality of his self-presentation, a man who had constructed a public identity so elaborately and so consistently that the private reasoning behind his professional decisions is often invisible behind the performance of what the reasoning was supposed to look like. Fact number 29. In the spring of 1940, approximately 22,000 Polish officers, police personnel and intellectuals were killed by the Soviet NKVD, shot in the back of the head in forests and buried in mass graves. The Soviet Union denied responsibility for this massacre at Katyn for 50 years, blaming Germany even at the Nuremberg trials in the face of evidence that was by the 1950s sufficient to establish Soviet guilt to the satisfaction of most independent investigators. When the Soviet Union finally admitted responsibility in 1990, it confirmed what most serious historians already knew. What it did not fully resolve was the specific decision-making process behind the killing. The core documents, including the proposal from NKVD Chief Beria and the Politburo resolution approving it, have been released. The surrounding record is less complete. The discussions that preceded the formal decision, the specific roles of specific individuals in advocating for or acquiescing in the killing of 22,000 people, remain partially in shadow. The interior of one of the 20th century's most consequential single acts of political murder remains partly unrecovered even after the basic fact of responsibility was finally acknowledged. Fact number 30. Winston Churchill consistently preferred fighting Germany through the Mediterranean and North Africa rather than committing to a direct cross-channel invasion of France. He advocated this peripheral strategy persistently against considerable American pressure for an earlier frontal assault. The question of why has never been fully settled. Was it genuine military judgment about the catastrophic risks of a premature channel crossing? The deep scar left by the Gallipoli disaster he helped create in the First World War, a failure that had effectively ended his political career once before. A broader strategic vision about Britain's post-war interests in the Mediterranean and Middle East, some shifting combination of all three. Churchill wrote 6 volumes about the war himself, which both illuminates and obscures his reasoning. He was a masterful narrator of his own history. The historian David Reynolds, studying how Churchill's memoirs were actually constructed, showed that the gap between the retrospective account and the contemporary documentary record is significant in ways that matter for understanding what Churchill actually believed at the time. That gap can't be fully closed, partly because Churchill himself was involved throughout the war in actively managing his own historical record. Fact number 31. In the final days of April 1945, in an underground bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, Eva Braun married Adolf Hitler in a brief ceremony. Less than 40 hours later, both were dead. The deaths, suicide by cyanide and gunshot, are documented in survivor testimonies with sufficient consistency to establish the basic facts beyond reasonable dispute. What hasn't been established with equivalent clarity is the psychological interior of those final weeks. What did Hitler actually believe about the outcome in the war's closing months? At what specific point did the man who had spent 12 years projecting absolute invincibility privately acknowledge that it was over? And does the specific combination of self-deception and occasional lucidity that the bunker testimonies variously describe represent his genuine psychological state, or the retrospective construction of witnesses whose own survival gave them reasons to shape their accounts in particular ways? The Soviet autopsy report on the remains found in the Reich Chancellery Garden was classified for decades, and its eventual release raised as many questions as it answered. The question of whether the man who died in the bunker on April 30th had, in some meaningful psychological sense, already ceased to exist long before the cyanide and the gunshot, remains a question the surviving testimony approaches from multiple directions without resolving. Fact number 32. On June 10, 1940, with the fall of France already effectively complete, Benito Mussolini declared war on Britain and France. Historians have generally called this opportunistic, a grab for territorial concessions at the moment of apparent German triumph. What has proved more difficult to establish is the full interior of Mussolini's strategic calculation. Did he genuinely believe that a German-dominated Europe offered Italy the role of junior imperial partner he envisioned? Did he understand the military weakness that the subsequent disasters in Greece, North Africa, and the Soviet Union would expose so devastatingly? Did the decision reflect a coherent strategic vision, or a personal gamble driven by a leader who had built his authority entirely on the performance of decisive action and simply could not afford to appear as a bystander at the apparent transformation of Europe? His private correspondence and diary offer partial and contradictory evidence, as the private records of men who perform their own convictions for the historical record consistently do. The Italy that entered the war was not the Italy its leader believed he was commanding, and whether Mussolini knew this and acted anyway or couldn't afford to find out, is a question the surviving record distributes across both possibilities without committing to either. Fact number 33. In the days before the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American aircraft had dropped warning leaflets over 35 Japanese cities, cautioning civilians about imminent bombardment. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not among the cities warned. Why? Was the omission deliberate, a calculation that warning the population would compromise the psychological impact the weapon was intended to produce? Was it driven by the specific security requirements around a weapon whose exact nature was still classified? Was it simply a bureaucratic gap in the leaflet distribution system? The American decision-making record partially addresses these possibilities. The Japanese response to the available intelligence partially addresses them. Neither record combined produces a completely satisfying account of why the populations of those specific cities were not given the warning that the general leafleting program might have been thought to require. The question is not primarily about the bombs themselves. It's about the specific decision made by specific people in specific circumstances, not to warn the people who were about to die. Fact number 34. In July 1942, Admiral Dudley Pound gave the order to scatter convoy PQ-17, a group of merchant ships carrying vital supplies to the Soviet Union through the Arctic. The order was based on intelligence indicating that the German battleship Tirpitz had left its Norwegian fjord and was heading to intercept the convoy. The intelligence was correct about the Tirpitz departing. It was wrong about its intentions. The Tirpitz returned to port without engaging. Without their escorting warships, the scattered merchant ships were hunted down individually. 24 of the convoy's 35 ships were sunk by German submarines and aircraft. Why did Pound conclude that scattering was the right response to the Tirpitz threat rather than maintaining the convoy's defensive formation? The question has been examined extensively, partly because Pound died in 1943 without leaving a complete account of his reasoning, and partly because the consequences were so catastrophic that the survivors of the convoy carried the question for the rest of their lives. The surviving records approach his reasoning without fully reconstructing it. The decision that cost 24 ships and their crews remains, in its full interior, imperfectly explained. Fact number 35. After the liberation of France in 1944, approximately 10,000 women had their heads publicly shaved for alleged sexual relationships with German occupiers. These women were not given trials. The evidence for their relationships was rarely formally established. The punishment was carried out by communities enacting a kind of justice that operated entirely outside any legal framework, and it targeted women specifically for a form of collaboration that male collaborators had not been and would not be subjected to in any equivalent way. The historical and feminist literature on this subject, the Tante, the head shaving, has examined its mechanisms and social function with considerable rigor. The conclusions are not seriously disputed. The punishment was gendered, frequently applied without adequate evidence, and served community functions related to post-occupation identity that had limited connection to genuine accountability. What hasn't been fully resolved is the psychology of the communities that conducted it, the specific motivations of individuals who initiated each instance, the degree to which it expressed genuine moral outrage versus the displacement of collective guilt onto vulnerable people, and the relationship between what was done to these women and what the communities doing it were avoiding examining about their own conduct during the occupation. Fact number 36. The Japanese Army's conduct in China between 1937 and 1945 included the Nanjing Massacre, the use of biological weapons by the notorious Unit 731, and the systematic exploitation of civilian populations across occupied territory. The post-war Tokyo trials addressed this with findings that subsequent historians have consistently found inadequate. General Matsui Iwane was executed for the Nanjing Massacre, but the specific chain of command between his orders and the actual violence has remained contested. More fundamentally, how does an army produce what happened at Nanjing? Not the behavior of individual violent actors, but sustained, organized, widespread violence by tens of thousands of soldiers across weeks. The question about the institutional psychology and military culture that made this possible is one the surviving evidence approaches without fully answering. Documents destroyed in the days between surrender and American occupation, whose absence the Tokyo prosecutors noted with frustration, are precisely the documents most likely to have addressed the command level of the question. What survives is primarily evidence of the consequences. Working backward from consequences to the specific decisions and specific institutional dynamics that produced them is an exercise the historical record supports only partially. Fact number 37. At the Nuremberg trials, Albert Speer presented himself as a technocrat, a man responsible for German war production who had no direct knowledge of the Holocaust. He was Hitler's armaments minister, he argued, not a participant in the regime's criminal enterprise. The tribunal accepted enough of this account to spare his life, sentencing him to 20 years in prison rather than execution. Subsequent historical literature, particularly Gitta Sereni's exhaustive engagement with Speer in her book Albert Speer, His Battle with Truth, established that his Nuremberg account was not accurate in several specific respects, and that he had access to information about the murder of European Jews that his self-presentation consistently denied. What the literature hasn't been able to establish is the full interior of Speer's knowledge, the specific point at which he understood what he understood, the cognitive and moral mechanisms by which a man of evident intelligence maintained a position of studied ignorance, whether his account was a deliberate construction or a genuine, self-serving and ultimately self-deceiving reorganization of his own memory. Sereni's conclusion that Speer had over decades genuinely come to believe a version of events that was not true is the most careful assessment the evidence supports. It doesn't resolve the question so much as reframe it. Fact number 38. On the morning of June 22, 1941, Germany launched the largest military invasion in human history against the Soviet Union. The specific hours that followed at the highest levels of Soviet command are documented in memoirs, partial archives, and interested testimony, and they describe something like paralysis. Georgy Zhukov's memoirs describe Stalin as deeply shaken, apparently immobilized by the scale of the catastrophe. But was the immobilization genuine psychological collapse, strategic calculation, some combination the surviving evidence cannot separate? Historians of the Soviet Union have examined this with every tool available: the partial archives, the memoirs written by men with powerful reasons to describe what they witnessed in particular ways, without arriving at a settled account. The specific interior of Stalin in those 48 hours, when the decisions made or not made were shaping the initial catastrophe of the German advance, is one of the war's most consequential unrecovered psychological territories. We know what happened. We don't fully know what was happening inside the man at the center of it. Fact number 39. The question of what happened to the gold looted by the Nazis, taken from occupied countries, from central banks, from Jewish victims stripped of everything they owned, and where it traveled in the war's final months and post-war years, has been examined by historians, by a major American government report in 1996, and by Swiss banking inquiries with considerable thoroughness. The general picture of the flows is established. The specific destinations are less completely documented. The Swiss banking system's role as a repository for gold of problematic provenance is established. Specific transactions, specific amounts, specific individual decisions about accepting specific deposits, these are documented in some cases and not in others. The distinction between documented and undocumented cases is not random. It reflects the survival of records whose keepers had reasons to preserve some and destroy others. The Tripartite Gold Commission, established after the war to return looted gold to its countries of origin, operated for 50 years and closed in 1998 with a portion of its holdings still unaccounted for in terms of original ownership. The specific fate of that unaccounted portion, which countries it came from, which individuals it was taken from, where in the post-war financial system it eventually came to rest, is a question whose answer the available evidence approaches but does not complete. Fact number 40. The German resistance to Hitler, the networks of conspirators that culminated in the July 20th assassination attempt, represents a genuine and sustained effort conducted at enormous personal risk by people who understood exactly what they were risking. Whether that resistance, under different circumstances, could have succeeded in removing Hitler and negotiating an end to the war significantly before May 1945 is a question military historians and political scientists have examined without reaching consensus. The obstacles were multiple and real: Gestapo penetration of several networks, the military command's unwillingness to act without confirmed proof of Hitler's death, the Allied commitment to unconditional surrender that limited what any German government could offer, and specific failures of nerve at critical moments. Whether a different combination of circumstances would have produced a different outcome depends on which circumstances are altered and how, and the range of plausible alterations produces a range of plausible outcomes whose probability can't be calculated. What is clear: the resistance was real, serious, and sustained at enormous personal cost. Its failure was not predetermined. Beyond that, the honest answer is a careful uncertainty that the historical record sustains and does not resolve. Fact number 41. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the internment of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans. The documentary record shows clearly what was decided and who advocated for it. General John DeWitt's justification, military necessity based on reports of Japanese-American espionage, has been shown by subsequent research to have rested on fabricated intelligence. The FBI and naval intelligence both knew there was no actual evidence supporting those reports at the time. What the record doesn't show with equivalent clarity is the specific interior of Roosevelt's decision. Did he believe the security justification? Did he understand it as pretextual and sign the order for political reasons he didn't articulate? Was the distinction between those two states of mind even as clear-cut in the specific conditions of February 1942 as the retrospective examination makes it appear? The Supreme Court's 1944 decision upholding the internment was formally repudiated in 2018. The specific reasoning of the man who signed the original order remains, in its full interior, unrecovered. Fact number 42. In 1940, Nazi planners developed seriously what was called the Madagascar Plan, a proposal to deport all European Jews to the island of Madagascar under German administration. The plan was developed with real bureaucratic thoroughness. It was eventually abandoned when Germany's failure to defeat Britain made the necessary control of Atlantic sea routes unavailable. Was the Madagascar Plan ever a genuine alternative to extermination? Or did it function, from the beginning, as an administrative placeholder, a way for the regime to appear to be managing the Jewish question through relocation while a more radical solution was being developed in parallel? Historians who have examined the plan in detail have shown it was developed with sufficient seriousness to suggest genuine intent at some administrative levels. The question of intent at the top decision-making level, whether Heydrich, Himmler, and Hitler viewed it as a real destination or as a transitional cover story, is one the documents support discussing but not settling. Whether its abandonment was the abandonment of a genuine alternative or the removal of a cover story whose usefulness had ended, shapes how we understand the timeline of the decision for extermination. It remains, in the specific form the question requires, open. Fact number 43. The three Operation Reinhard death camps, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, were designed for a single purpose: the immediate killing of everyone who arrived. Treblinka's approximately 900,000 victims left fewer than 70 survivors. The operational details of these camps have been reconstructed from those few survivor testimonies, from perpetrator accounts, and from recent archaeological investigations. What those sources cannot fully reconstruct is the specific decision-making process by which the camps were designed as they were, who made the specific architectural and operational choices that distinguished them from earlier killing methods, in what discussions were those choices made. What was the specific thinking behind the design of a system optimized with terrible efficiency for the rate of killing it achieved? The perpetrators who could have answered these questions most directly were killed or dispersed when Operation Reinhard was wound up, and the camps themselves were physically destroyed, buried, and planted over with trees. The specific interior of the decisions that produced the most efficient killing installations in human history is one of the Holocaust's most consequential unrecovered territories. Fact number 44. Did the British government know, before it happened, that Coventry would be bombed on the night of November 14, 1940? And if so, did someone decide not to warn the city in order to protect the secret that British intelligence had cracked Germany's military codes? This claim entered popular history through F.W. Winterbotham's 1974 account and has persisted ever since. The scholarly consensus based on the released intelligence records is that the available intercepts on November 14 indicated a major German operation but did not specifically identify Coventry as the target before the raid began. Most historians who have worked carefully with the Ultra records are satisfied that the foreknowledge claim, in its strongest form, is based on a misunderstanding of what the intelligence actually showed. What the consensus hasn't entirely eliminated is the question of whether all relevant records have been released, whether the intelligence picture available to the most senior decision makers was identical to the picture the released archives show, and why this specific claim proved so durable in public memory that its refutation required the work it did. The question is settled to the satisfaction of most historians. It is not settled to the satisfaction of all. That gap has a quality that straightforward factual resolution doesn't always close. Fact number 45. The Amber Room was an ornate chamber of amber panels, gold, and mirrors created in the 18th century for the Russian imperial palace at Tsarskoye Selo. German forces disassembled it in 1941 and transported it to Königsberg. After that, its documented trail ends. It may have been destroyed in Allied bombing in 1944 or in the Soviet assault on Königsberg in 1945. It may have been moved before those events to a destination that no subsequent investigation has located. Claims of discovery have been made repeatedly and assessed as unsubstantiated. Post-war investigations by Soviet and German authorities alike produced no confirmed finding. A reconstructed Amber Room was installed in the Catherine Palace in 2003. The original is listed in official records as having an unknown fate, which is the honest answer, and is the answer that decades of enormous investigative effort have not improved upon. The Amber Room stands as perhaps the most famous object in the entire catalogue of wartime losses whose ultimate destination remains genuinely, stubbornly unknown. Fact number 46. Operation Market Garden, launched in September 1944, was Bernard Montgomery's ambitious plan to drop Allied airborne forces deep into the Netherlands and capture a series of bridges, ending the war before Christmas. It failed most catastrophically at Arnhem. Before the operation launched, intelligence had identified SS Panzer divisions resting in the Arnhem area. The decision to proceed anyway has been debated ever since. Cornelius Ryan's account in A Bridge Too Far documented the intelligence failure with considerable detail. What subsequent scholarship has complicated without resolving is the more specific question. How was that intelligence weighted by the people making the operational decisions? What did Montgomery know? What did his intelligence officers tell him they knew? What was the relationship between the information available and the assessment communicated upward? And does the process by which the decision was made and maintained in the face of warning signs represent an institutional failure of the intelligence operations relationship, or the specific psychology of a commander who had committed to an operation and was resistant to information that contradicted that commitment? The men most central to those specific decisions are gone. The gap between the documented intelligence and the documented decision remains wider than any subsequent account has successfully bridged. Fact number 47. The specific moment at which Japan's senior leadership recognized that the war was lost, and the specific reasoning by which that recognition was managed within an institutional culture that had no legitimate mechanism for acknowledging defeat, is a question the historical record of the war's final year approaches without fully resolving. The firebombing of Tokyo, the fall of Okinawa, the destruction of the Japanese Navy and Air Force as functional fighting forces, these are documented in their operational dimensions with considerable precision. What the documents don't fully reconstruct is the interior of the decision-making process within the Supreme War Council in the months between these catastrophes and the surrender. Who said what arguments were advanced for continuation and what for negotiation, and the specific psychology of a governing structure attempting to process the knowledge of defeat within an ideological framework that had made acknowledging defeat conceptually almost impossible. The records of the Supreme War Council meetings were destroyed before the American occupation. The accounts of surviving participants were shaped by the specific pressures of the post-war environment in ways that subsequent historians have been able to partially identify but not fully correct for. Fact number 48. The Katyn Massacre, the killing of approximately 22,000 Polish officers, police and intellectuals by the Soviet NKVD in 1940, is well documented, but it was not the only killing. Soviet forces occupied eastern Poland between 1939 and 1941, and an unknown number of Polish citizens beyond the Katyn victims were arrested and disappeared into the Soviet system without leaving recoverable traces. The Russian government's 2004 decision to reclassify the full Katyn investigation documents, reversing the partial archive opening that had occurred under Yeltsin, means the complete accounting of what happened to the arrested Polish population of eastern Poland in those years remains officially unavailable. Polish historians and families of the missing have continued working with what is accessible. The partial picture that has emerged suggests a mortality significantly larger than the 3 specific Katyn sites account for. The question of the full scale of the killing and the specific fate of specific individuals remains open, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the evidence that exists is held in archives whose accessibility reflects political decisions that are themselves part of what requires explanation. Fact number 49. From February 1942 onward, the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command pursued a policy of deliberately targeting German civilian residential areas rather than industrial infrastructure. The policy was sustained with increasing intensity through to the end of the war, despite mounting internal evidence that the destruction of German cities was not producing the collapse of German industrial output or civilian morale that the policy's rationale required. Arthur Harris's personal commitment to area bombing is documented and unambiguous. The Air Ministry's consistent support for his approach is also documented. What the documents don't fully reconstruct is the specific reasoning of the senior civilian decision-makers, Churchill, Portal, Sinclair, in the crucial periods when the policy was reviewed and maintained despite its contested effectiveness. Was the maintenance driven by genuine conviction that the policy was working, a calculation that alternatives were worse, a momentum that had grown too large to redirect, some shifting combination whose specific weighting varied by individual and moment? The policy's moral legacy is still contested. The specific reasoning of the people most responsible for sustaining it is, in its full interior, imperfectly recovered. Fact number 50. Heinrich Müller was the head of the Gestapo, the man responsible for administering the Nazi terror apparatus throughout the entire war. He is the most senior Nazi official whose post-war fate has never been confirmed. A body exhumed from a Berlin cemetery in 1963 was found to contain the remains of 3 different individuals, none definitively identified as Müller. CIA documents released under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act suggest the agency received reports of a living Müller in various post-war locations and never resolved them to a confirmed conclusion. The specific quality of the uncertainty about Müller compared to the confirmed post-war fates of other senior Nazi officials reflects both the destruction of records in Berlin's final weeks and the specific nature of his work. Running the Gestapo had given him enemies on every side and had also given him the operational skills and knowledge of documentation procedures that would have been most useful to a man attempting to disappear completely. Whether he disappeared into death or into the post-war world is a question that 80 years of investigation has left with unusual stubbornness open. Fact number 51. France built the Maginot Line along the Franco-German border, an extraordinary engineering achievement, and organized its entire defensive doctrine around it. In May 1940, German forces bypassed it entirely, moving through the Ardennes in a direction French military planning had assessed as insufficiently passable for armored vehicles. The French army collapsed with a speed that astonished observers on all sides, including the Germans. Why? The explanations are multiple. Specific failure of military doctrine, specific failure of political will, specific failure of intelligence assessment, the demoralization of a society that had bled itself nearly to death 20 years earlier and could not find the internal resources for another such confrontation. The evidence supports all of these discussions without definitively establishing their relative weight. Marc Bloch's Strange Defeat, written immediately after the armistice by a French historian who had served in both wars, remains among the most penetrating attempts to answer the question from the inside. His conclusion, that the defeat reflected a failure of the French elite as much as a failure of French arms, is one of several available assessments that the subsequent literature has refined without replacing. Fact number 52. During the 1945 liberation of the Philippines, the fighting for Manila produced a civilian death toll estimated at over 100,000 people. A city that had been declared an open city at the war's start, whose civilian population had expected some protection, became instead one of the war's worst scenes of urban devastation. The specific decisions made by Japanese commanders to defend Manila against orders to abandon it, the specific decisions by American commanders about artillery use in a densely populated urban environment, the specific dynamics of a battle where the boundary between military and civilian spaces had been completely dissolved, all of these are documented in operational records that establish what happened without fully accounting for why. The Manila Massacre, in which Japanese naval troops under Rear Admiral Iwabuchi killed tens of thousands of Filipino civilians in an orgy of violence whose specific motivation remains disputed, represents one of the Pacific War's largest single atrocities against civilians and one whose command responsibility, the specific chain of authorization, from Iwabuchi upward, has never been fully established. Fact number 53. As Allied forces advanced into Germany in the war's closing months and the full scale of the Holocaust became publicly undeniable, a question began forming that would occupy historians, philosophers, and ordinary people for the rest of the century. How had this been possible? Not the logistical mechanics, those were thoroughly documented at Nuremberg, but the deeper question of what it meant about human beings and human institutions that such a thing had been possible at all. Hannah Arendt's coverage of the Eichmann trial produced her concept of the banality of evil, the idea that the Holocaust had been administered not by monsters but by functionaries whose defining characteristic was not sadism but a specific failure of moral imagination she called thoughtlessness. The argument has been challenged. The historian Bettina Stangnath established that the performance of banality in Jerusalem was itself a performance, that the private Eichmann was considerably more ideologically committed than the public trial suggested. What neither Arendt's account nor Stangnath's revision fully resolves is the broader question about the relationship between ideology, institutional participation, and individual moral responsibility. The specific case of Eichmann illuminates the question. It doesn't exhaust it. Fact number 54. In September 1942, approximately 15,000 children were deported from the Łódź ghetto to Chelmno extermination camp. The ghetto elder Szymon addressed the community in a speech asking parents to surrender their children so that others might survive. That speech has been examined by historians ever since as one of the most morally complex documents the Holocaust produced. Was Rumkowski making a terrible calculation he understood to be real? Had he lost his moral bearings entirely under the pressure of his position? Did he understand that the choice he was presenting was not a real choice? Primo Levi examined Rumkowski in The Drowned and the Saved as a figure who illustrated the specific moral contamination that extreme situations impose on the people caught inside them, neither simply villain nor simply victim, resisting the simplifications both framings required. The question of what Rumkowski believed and intended in September 1942 is finally a question about what any person becomes under the specific pressures of an impossible situation. The answer the evidence supports is honest uncertainty, and perhaps that uncertainty is itself the most honest thing that can be said. Fact number 55. British intelligence during the war ran something called the Double Cross System, a remarkable operation in which virtually every German spy working in Britain was captured and turned into a British-controlled double agent, feeding Germany false information throughout the war. J.C. Masterman's 1972 account documented its extraordinary success in detail, and immediately raised the question of why German intelligence never identified the systematic failure of its entire British network. The explanations available: the Abwehr's institutional dysfunction, the psychology of an intelligence organization that had invested heavily in agents and resisted evidence of their compromise, the role of internal German politics in limiting effective counterintelligence, are all relevant and none fully satisfying. The possibility that some level of German intelligence did suspect the compromise and made a calculation that a controlled deception was more useful than a dismantled network has been raised and examined without being definitively established or refuted. What the question ultimately touches is the specific psychology of institutional self-deception in intelligence organizations, a phenomenon well documented in general terms and imperfectly reconstructed in the specific German case. Fact number 56. Pope Pius XII maintained a policy of public silence toward the Nazi persecution and murder of European Jews throughout the war. That silence has been defended as the product of careful diplomatic calculation, that public condemnation would achieve nothing and might make things worse, and attacked as a failure of moral courage whose consequences were measured in lives. The Vatican archives were opened to researchers in 2020, giving historians access that previous generations were denied. The initial assessments have complicated both the strongest defenses and the strongest criticisms. David Kurtz's research in the newly opened archives found evidence that Pius V had more specific knowledge of the deportations and their destination than the most charitable accounts of his decision-making had assumed. What the archives cannot provide is the full interior of the decision, the specific weighting of diplomatic calculation against moral imperative, the specific fear about what public condemnation would produce, the specific relationship between Pius V's private convictions and his public silence. No archive can provide that. The question has been enriched by the new material. It has not been settled. Fact number 57. Operation Fortitude was the Allied deception plan that convinced German commanders that the Normandy landing was a feint and that the main invasion would fall on the Pas de Calais. It worked. The specific mechanisms by which it worked are well documented. What has proved more difficult to explain is not the deception's success but its extraordinary duration. For weeks after the Normandy landings had established a substantial beachhead, the German command maintained its assessment that the main invasion was still coming at the Pas de Calais. By any rational military analysis, Normandy had clearly become the main event. 15 German divisions north of the Seine stayed in place rather than being committed to driving the Allied forces back into the sea. Why did Hitler and German High Command maintain the Pas de Calais fixation so long? Was it primarily the deception's continued effectiveness, or primarily Hitler's own strategic preconceptions making him resistant to contradictory evidence? The surviving German command records and the ultra-intelligence illuminate this from different angles without producing a completely unified account of the mechanism that may have saved the Allied beachhead. Fact number 58. Klaus Barbie was the Gestapo chief in Lyon whose torture and deportation of Jewish children from the Issue Children's Home became the most cited specific charge at his 1987 trial. He had fled to South America in 1951, assisted by a network that included elements of American intelligence which had employed him in post-war Germany for his knowledge of communist networks. A 1983 Justice Department report acknowledged American responsibility for Barbie's escape and apologized to France. It did not provide the complete account that the full documentary record would have permitted. The extent of American knowledge about his wartime crimes at the time of his employment, the specific calculations made about the trade-off between his intelligence value and his criminal history, and the specific assistance provided for his escape. These questions are documented in ways that establish the general shape of what happened without filling in all the specific decisions made by specific people. The portions of that record that remain classified, and the specific reasons for their continued classification decades after the events they describe, are themselves questions the available evidence supports asking without permitting a complete answer. Fact number 59. Soviet spies inside the Manhattan Project, including Klaus Fuchs, David Greenglass, and others connected to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, provided Soviet intelligence with significant details about American atomic bomb design. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, years earlier than American planners had expected. Did the espionage make the difference, or would Soviet physicists have arrived at the same point within a comparable time frame anyway? The opening of Soviet archives after 1991 addressed this partially. The historian David Holloway's work in Stalin and the Bomb suggests the espionage provided specific technical details that reduced uncertainty and eliminated certain experimental dead ends, but that the fundamental scientific capability required was present in the Soviet Union independently. The specific question of how much time the intelligence saved, how many years separated the actual 1949 test from the test that would have occurred without the espionage, is a counterfactual the evidence supports estimating but not determining. The estimates in the literature range widely enough to encompass both the conclusion that the espionage was decisive and the conclusion that it was a useful acceleration of an outcome Soviet scientific capability made inevitable regardless. Fact number 60. What did ordinary Germans know about the Holocaust during the war? The older framing of this question, organized around the binary of knowing and not knowing, has been replaced by something more nuanced in recent scholarship. The historian Peter Longerich describes what he calls a policy of systematic semi-concealment, a regime that communicated the broad outlines of what was happening to Jewish people in ways that were legible to those who chose to read them, while maintaining enough ambiguity to provide deniability to those who chose to claim it. The question this reframing raises is, how many people made which choice? The evidence approaches this statistically without being able to answer it at the level of individual consciousness that the moral question ultimately requires. The census of individual knowing, individual not knowing, and the vast territory of deliberate semi-knowledge that the regime specifically designed to exist between those two poles, that census is one that no post-war investigation has completed. The deaths of the relevant witnesses have made it permanently less completable than it was when they were alive. Fact number 61. Somewhere in the Japanese military command structure in the days between the surrender announcement and the American occupation, a decision was made to destroy documents, millions of pages of records relating to Unit 731, to comfort women, to prisoner treatment, to specific operational orders across the Pacific Theater. Records that would have been the most direct evidence at the Tokyo trials were burned or otherwise destroyed. The destruction was systematic enough to have been organized. It was authorized. Someone made the decision. Someone communicated it. Someone carried it out. The specific authorization, who gave the order, in what form, to whom, is not recoverable from the surviving record because the surviving record is precisely what remains after the most important parts of it were destroyed. What the absence of the record communicates is a deliberate shaping of the historical account of the Pacific War, conducted in the gap between surrender and occupation, with the specific purpose of limiting accountability. The question of what the destroyed documents contained, and how they would have altered both the Tokyo trials and the subsequent historical understanding of Japanese conduct in the war, is answered only by the general shape of what is known from surviving sources and the gap between that shape and the more complete picture that was deliberately made unavailable. Fact number 62. Adolf Hitler accumulated thousands of paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects for a planned museum in his hometown of Linz. In the war's final weeks, this collection was dispersed. Allied monuments men and subsequent researchers tracked much of it. The portion that hasn't been found exists in the research literature as a category of unknown size containing objects of unknown identity in locations the available documentation doesn't identify. The 2012 discovery of the Gurlitt collection in a Munich apartment, over 1,400 works including pieces whose provenance traced to Nazi looting, demonstrated that the post-war accounting of looted art had left significant quantities undiscovered in private hands for nearly 7 decades. A single large cache that had been entirely outside the established research picture. What the Gurlitt discovery suggests is that the total quantity of undiscovered looted art and the specific locations where it remains is a question whose answer the available investigative record has not exhausted. Subsequent discoveries will continue to revise the picture. The revision is ongoing. Fact number 63. On July 4, 1943, General Władysław Sikorski, Prime Minister of the Polish government in exile and Commander-in-Chief of Polish Armed Forces, was killed when his plane crashed into the sea seconds after taking off from Gibraltar. The official finding was accident, jamming of the elevator controls consistent with the physical evidence. The investigation also noted, however, that the evidence was insufficient to rule out other causes. Sikorski had been pressing Churchill and Stalin on the Katyn question and was a potential obstacle to Stalin's post-war plans for Poland. The combination of his specific political significance and the timing and location of the crash has sustained speculation about deliberate sabotage that no subsequent investigation has been able to definitively confirm or definitively eliminate. A 2008 exhumation produced forensic findings that Polish government experts assessed as consistent with accident and that independent forensic experts assessed in ways that did not fully converge. Whether Sikorski died from a mechanical failure, deliberate sabotage, or something between those two categories, pilot error, introduced negligence, something with plausible deniability, is a question that the physical evidence and the documentary record taken together have illuminated without resolving across 8 decades of inquiry. Fact number 64. How much did ordinary Germans' pre-existing anti-Semitism contribute to the Holocaust as distinct from organizational coercion, ideological indoctrination, and the specific institutional dynamics of the killing process? This question sits at the center of one of the most consequential historical debates of the post-war period. Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men and Daniel Goldhagen's Hitler's Willing Executioners examined substantially the same evidence, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and its participation in the murder of Jews in occupied Poland, and reached substantially different conclusions. Browning emphasized situational factors, peer pressure, authority, the specific organizational context over pre-existing ideology. Goldhagen emphasized a specifically German eliminationist anti-Semitism as the primary motivating factor. The debate is not simply a matter of competing interpretations of the same evidence, it is a debate about what kind of explanation the evidence is being asked to provide, and the answer to that meta-question shapes what the evidence is read as showing. Both books illuminate something real. Neither has been accepted as the complete account. The question of why ordinary people kill other people in large numbers under state authorization is one the specific German case illuminates and that no single explanatory framework has yet fully contained. Fact number 65. Did the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Germany achieve results proportionate to its cost, in aircraft, in aircrew lives, in resources, and in the moral weight of the civilian deaths it produced? The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war, concluded that the bombing had significantly damaged German war production and was a material factor in Germany's defeat. The specific conclusions have been challenged by economists and historians who examined the same underlying data and reached different conclusions about the relationship between bombing damage and production output. The question is not simply historical. It bears directly on the moral accounting of a campaign that killed approximately 300,000 German civilians and was sustained, partly, on the basis of effectiveness claims whose full validity remains contested. An honest engagement with that moral accounting requires an honest engagement with the effectiveness question. The honest answer is more complicated than either the survey's conclusions or the strongest critiques of those conclusions separately acknowledge. Fact number 66. What did the Japanese defenders of islands like Iwo Jima, Peleliu, and Okinawa understand their defense to be achieving strategically? The tactical rationale, inflicting maximum casualties to raise the cost of the anticipated home island's invasion, is documented in Japanese operational planning. Several Japanese officers who survived Okinawa described in post-war accounts a private awareness of the gap between the official rationale for the defense and the operational reality of what that defense was actually achieving, and a corresponding difficulty finding a framework within the available ideology and institutional culture for processing that awareness in a way that might have produced different behavior. Fact number 67. Did Franklin Roosevelt know, before his death in April 1945, the full extent of what American forces would find in the German concentration camps? And if he did that knowledge affect his assessment of how to treat Germany in the Yalta negotiations of February 1945? Intelligence about the camps was available in various forms to the American government before Yalta. What reached Roosevelt personally, in what form, and with what level of specificity, is complicated by the specific informational management practices of an administration in which access to the president was carefully controlled. The specific content of what Roosevelt read and heard is not always recoverable from the surviving documentation. Roosevelt biographers including Robert Dallek have worked carefully with the available evidence and reached conclusions that are tentative in precisely the respects the evidence requires. The question matters for understanding Yalta, the specific concessions made to Stalin, the specific framework established for post-war Europe, because the relationship between what was known about Nazi crimes and what was decided about post-war accountability is a question whose answer shapes how the decisions made at Yalta are ultimately understood. Fact number 68. Was the French resistance a militarily significant factor in the outcome of the war, or primarily a psychologically and politically significant one for French national identity? The resistance contribution to the D-Day operation through intelligence and sabotage is documented and assessed as real and significant. Its broader contribution across the occupation years is assessed differently by different historians, with estimates of German forces tied down by resistance activity varying enough to produce substantially different conclusions about the military weight of the total effort. The question is complicated by its political sensitivity. The resistance narrative is foundational to post-war French national identity in ways that create pressures, operating in both directions, to assess its military significance through frameworks other than the purely military one. An honest military history of the French resistance, one that assessed its contribution with the same methodology applied to any other military force, would produce conclusions the available evidence supports and that the political weight of the question has made consistently difficult to state, with the bluntness that honest military history requires. Both the resistance and the difficulty of assessing it honestly are themselves part of the war's legacy. Fact number 69. The chain of events through which nuclear secrets passed from the Manhattan Project to Soviet intelligence, through Klaus Fuchs, Theodore Hall, and others, has been substantially reconstructed from the Venona intercepts, partially opened Soviet archives, and the confessions and testimonies of participants. What hasn't been fully established is the specific question of how much the Soviet program's leadership understood, in real time, about the quality of the intelligence it was receiving. Did the Soviet physicists working with the espionage material recognize its significance as they worked with it, or did the significance become fully apparent only when the American test provided a reference point against which the intelligence could be evaluated? The distinction matters for understanding the specific contribution of the espionage to the Soviet program's timeline. The surviving Soviet scientific and intelligence records address this question in ways that have supported different conclusions from different researchers examining the same underlying material. It is one of the Cold War's foundational questions, the relationship between espionage and nuclear proliferation, and the specific answer at the level of individual understanding and real-time recognition remains genuinely contested. Fact number 70. The League of Nations was created specifically to prevent another catastrophic war. In the 1930s it failed to constrain the sequence of aggressions, Manchuria, Ethiopia, Spain, Czechoslovakia, that produced the Second World War. Why? Each specific failure can be explained in terms of the specific political configuration of the specific moment. The larger question, whether those specific explanations add up to a general account of why the institution failed, is more difficult. Was the failure inherent in the institution's design, in the specific distribution of power among its members, in the domestic politics of its most important members, in something about the specific historical moment that made the institution's functioning impossible regardless of its design? A debate between those who argue that collective security is a viable principle that was poorly implemented, and those who argue that it rests on assumptions about state behavior that the interwar period demonstrated to be false, has not been resolved by the subsequent history of the United Nations. The UN has both partially vindicated and partially extended the record of failure that its predecessor established. The fundamental question about whether international institutions can constrain state aggression, raised with unusual clarity by the war, remains in its deepest form open. Fact number 71. Romania, Hungary and Croatia allied with Germany and cooperated with German demands regarding their Jewish populations, but the cooperation was not uniform. Romania conducted its own massacres in Bessarabia and Transnistria with a brutality that exceeded German expectations. Hungary delayed deportation of its Jewish population until the German occupation of March 1944, and then cooperated with such speed and efficiency that 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz in less than 2 months, the most rapid large-scale deportation of the entire Holocaust. What did the specific decision-makers in Budapest, Bucharest, and Zagreb understand they were authorizing? Did they know the destination and purpose of the deportations? Did they choose not to know? Was the distinction between knowing and choosing not to know one they experienced as meaningful? These questions are documented to different degrees in different national archives. The historian Randolph Braham examined the Hungarian case with great thoroughness, establishing the general picture without fully recovering the specific interior of the decisions at the critical moments. The question of knowledge, choice, and the specific psychology of cooperation with genocide remains, for each of these national cases, imperfectly resolved. Fact number 72. On June 16, 1940, in the last hours before France requested an armistice, Winston Churchill made an extraordinary offer: complete political union between Britain and France, shared citizenship, a single war cabinet, a single parliament. The offer was drafted in considerable haste by a small group that included Jean Monnet and Charles de Gaulle. It was approved by the British War Cabinet. It reached the French government in time for its rejection by a majority of French cabinet members who preferred armistice. Was this a genuine constitutional proposal, or a desperate last gesture whose authors understood it couldn't be implemented in the available time, intended primarily as a demonstration of solidarity rather than a workable political arrangement? The minutes of the relevant meetings survive, but they cannot convey the full atmosphere of urgency and improvisation of those hours. Whether the men who drafted the offer believed they were proposing something real, something that would actually have been implemented had the French cabinet accepted, is a question that the available accounts answer differently depending on which participant's retrospective testimony is given most weight. In the chaos of June 1940, the line between genuine proposal and symbolic gesture may have been deliberately, even necessarily, unclear. Fact number 73. In the weeks before the fall of France, approximately 2,500 tons of gold bullion from the Bank of France were secretly shipped to West Africa and the Caribbean. For the rest of the war, this gold became the subject of extended negotiation between Vichy France, Germany, Britain, and eventually the United States. The specific decisions about how it was managed, what was transferred under German pressure, what was retained, and what became of it after liberation are documented in ways that establish the general trajectory without accounting for every specific movement. The broader question embedded in the gold's history is about something more fundamental: the specific mechanisms by which an occupied country's financial sovereignty is progressively compromised under occupation. At what points did the decisions of French financial officials cross from the management of an impossible situation into cooperation with German war aims? This is a question the financial history of Vichy France illuminates as a case study without the case study being complete enough to support all the conclusions the question invites. Fact number 74. In the summer and autumn of 1941, mobile killing units called the Einsatzgruppen shot approximately 1.5 million Jewish people in the occupied Soviet Union, in forests, at ravines, in fields, before the death camps were even operational. The operational reports of the Einsatzgruppen documented this with a bureaucratic thoroughness that the perpetrators apparently found entirely unproblematic. What motivated the men who carried out these killings? Was it primarily ideological conviction, a genuine belief in what they were doing? The specific dynamics of unit cohesion and peer pressure within a group conducting organized violence, careerism, and the specific incentives of advancement in an organization that rewarded participation. Some combination that varied by individual in ways the historical record cannot map with sufficient granularity. This is the foundational question of the scholarly debate about perpetrator motivation, the debate that Browning and Goldhagen approached from different directions and that subsequent scholarship has elaborated without resolving. What happened is documented exhaustively. Why it happened, in the specific interior sense of what was in the minds of the men pulling the triggers, is a question that the available psychological categories approach without fully capturing, and whose answer matters for understanding how mass killing is possible in general. Fact number 75. On May 24, 1940, with German armoured forces in a position to complete the encirclement of the British Expeditionary Force and Allied armies trapped at Dunkirk, a halt order was issued. The armies were not destroyed. Over the following days, 338,000 soldiers were evacuated from the beaches. The halt order has been attributed to Hitler's direct intervention, concerns about overextending armored units, Göring's insistence that the Luftwaffe finish the job from the air, and possibly a political calculation that allowing the British to escape might facilitate subsequent peace negotiations. These explanations are not mutually exclusive. Different historians weigh them differently. What the surviving record does not provide is the specific interior of the decision, the specific reasoning at the specific moment when the order was given, in a form that settles the relative weight of the available explanations. The Dunkirk evacuation was one of the war's most consequential single events, shaping everything that followed: Britain's continued resistance, the eventual Allied victory, the entire course of the war. The full explanation of why it was permitted to succeed remains a matter of serious scholarly disagreement 8 decades later. Fact number 76. Leon Trotsky, the man who had been the Soviet Union's second most powerful figure in the revolutionary period and who had in exile become Stalin's most persistent critic, was killed in Mexico City in August 1940 by Ramon Mercader, who drove an ice axe into his skull. Whether Stalin personally ordered or approved this assassination is a question that Soviet archives partially opened after 1991 have addressed without fully settling. The evidence for Soviet operational involvement is substantial. Mercader was subsequently awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal by the Soviet government, a fairly explicit posthumous acknowledgement of the operation's official character. The specific question of Stalin's personal authorization, however, whether it was explicitly approved at the highest level, or whether it was initiated by NKVD officers who understood what was wanted without requiring explicit direction, is one the available documentation approaches without settling in the specific form the question requires. The broader significance is what it reveals about the operational relationship between Stalin's personal will and NKVD action. Whether the specific authorization of specific operations was necessary or whether the system had developed, by 1940, a capacity to translate Stalin's general intentions into specific actions without leaving the paper trail explicit authorization would have created. Fact number 77. The International Red Cross knew during the war about the concentration camps and the Holocaust. The ICRC made a decision not to publish a public denunciation of what it knew. The historian Jean-Claude Favers examined the ICRC archives and carefully reconstructed the institution's reasoning that public denunciation would compromise its access to prisoners of war on all sides, that its mandate was legally and institutionally understood in a specific and limited way, that a public statement might provoke German retaliation against the prisoners the ICRC could currently reach. The reasoning is not without internal logic, but what the careful reconstruction of that reasoning cannot fully settle is the moral weight of the calculation, whether the protection of access to prisoners of war justified silence about the murder of millions of people who were not prisoners of war and whose only remaining advocate with knowledge and institutional standing was declining to speak. The ICRC's own 2002 statement acknowledging that the institution had failed morally represents an institutional acknowledgement of the question's weight. It does not resolve the specific historical and ethical terms in which that weight is distributed, a question that the careful historical account enriches without answering. Fact number 78. Could the Pacific War have been ended before the atomic bombings through a combination of naval blockade, conventional bombing, and diplomatic approaches that preserved the emperor's position? The evidence that elements of the Japanese government were seeking a negotiated end through Soviet mediation before the bombs were dropped is documented in intercepted communications that American decision-makers had access to. The specific question of whether those elements would have prevailed over the military faction committed to continued resistance, within what time frame, at what cost in lives during the interval, is one the historical record illuminates without answering. The answer depends on the internal dynamics of a Japanese decision-making process that was still in motion when the bombs ended it. The historian Tsuyoshi Hasegawa's Racing the Enemy, examining the final weeks of the Pacific War from American, Soviet, and Japanese perspectives simultaneously, is the most methodologically rigorous attempt to reconstruct those dynamics. Its conclusions are more qualified than either the standard American justification for the bombs or the standard revisionist critique of that justification separately allows. The honest answer remains genuinely uncertain. Fact number 79. The men who designed the operational architecture of the Holocaust solved its logistical problems with the same professional attention that their training had prepared them to apply to any other large-scale administrative challenge. How did bureaucratic competence and moral awareness coexist in those men? Zygmunt Bauman's Modernity and the Holocaust argued that the Holocaust was not an aberration from modern civilization but a product of it, that the organizational, technical, and administrative capacities that made it possible were the same capacities modern civilization had developed for other purposes, and that the moral distance built into bureaucratic organization was a feature rather than a bug in the context of genocide. The argument has been challenged without being dismantled. What it raises, and what the historical record of the Holocaust's administration consistently returns to, is the question of whether something in the specific structure of modern bureaucratic organization facilitates large-scale violence by distributing moral responsibility across so many actors and so many steps that no individual action feels like the action that matters. If the answer to that question is yes, then its implications extend beyond the specific historical case of the Holocaust into the present. That possibility is one that the Holocaust's administrative history raises, and that no single scholarly framework has yet fully examined. Fact number 80. After the war, hundreds of Nazi war criminals fled Europe through organized escape networks, the rat lines, reaching South America, the Middle East, and other destinations where they were never tried and never formally accounted for. The work of Nazi hunters including Simon Wiesenthal and the Klarsfeld Partnership, the declassified intelligence records of multiple governments, and the research of historians including Gerald Steinacker have established the general shape of these networks, the role of certain Catholic institutions in providing documentation and assistance, the role of Argentine and other South American governments in providing refuge, the role of Western intelligence agencies in protecting specific individuals whose knowledge of Soviet operations they valued. What the combined scholarship has not established is the complete accounting, the full list of names, the full map of destinations, the full record of which individuals in which institutions made which specific decisions to assist which specific people. The gaps in that accounting are not random. They reflect the specific interests of institutions and governments whose full cooperation with the investigative record would require an accounting of their own wartime and post-war decisions that has not been forthcoming. The infrastructure of impunity was real, was organized, and was protected. Its full architecture remains partially unmapped. Fact number 81. The Norwegian commandos who destroyed German heavy water production at Vemork in 1942 and 1943 are celebrated as heroes who prevented Nazi Germany from developing an atomic bomb. The historical assessment that the sabotage significantly delayed the German nuclear weapons program rests on an assumption that subsequent scholarship has substantially complicated, the assumption that the German program was more advanced and more seriously resourced than the evidence shows it to have been. Thomas Powers, Heisenberg's war, and the scholarly debate it generated have established that the German nuclear program was, by the time of the Wehrmacht sabotage, already significantly behind the Manhattan Project and was not on a trajectory to produce a weapon before the war's end, regardless of whether the heavy water supply was interrupted. This creates a question about the sabotage's actual strategic significance that the heroic narrative declines to ask, not because the sabotage was wrong or the courage of the men who conducted it was not genuine, but because the relationship between the act and its claimed strategic consequence is more complicated than the established account acknowledges. The full, honest history of the operation requires engaging with that complication rather than setting it aside in favor of a cleaner story. Fact number 82. The role of anti-Semitism within the specific decision-making of Allied governments, its influence on decisions about Jewish refugees before the war, decisions about bombing Auschwitz railway lines during the war, and decisions about the priority given to prosecuting war crimes against Jews in the immediate post-war period, is a question the historical literature has examined with increasing directness and that the available evidence supports discussing with considerable specificity. The Evian Conference of 1938, at which 32 countries declined to significantly increase their Jewish refugee quotas, is documented in ways that establish what was decided. The specific interior of each national delegation's decision, the precise mixture of anti-Semitic prejudice, domestic political calculation, economic anxiety, and bureaucratic inertia that produced each country's specific position, is recoverable in varying degrees for different national cases. The aggregate picture the scholarship produces is damning in its general outlines. Each specific national case is more complicated than the general outline. And the full question of intentionality, the specific moral weight of the specific choices made by specific governments, remains, in the full detail that honest accounting requires, incompletely mapped. Both the general indictment and the specific complexity of each national case are part of the honest answer. Fact number 83. Benito Mussolini was captured by communist partisans near Lake Como on April 27, 1945. He was executed the following day at Giuliano di Mezzegra. His body and that of his mistress Clara Petacci were subsequently displayed hanging upside down from a petrol station roof in Milan. The external facts are documented. What has never been fully established is the specific decision-making behind the execution. Who authorized it? What instructions were given to the partisan unit? And what role, if any, was played by British intelligence operatives who were, according to several accounts, in the vicinity in those final days? The British interest in the matter may have been related to a cache of correspondence between Mussolini and Churchill, letters whose content, recovery, and disposition have been the subject of research that has not arrived at documented conclusions that the evidentiary standard of serious historical scholarship can support. Whether the specific manner and timing of Mussolini's death was shaped by external interests, and specifically British interests in preventing a public trial at which certain documents might surface, is a question the available evidence supports raising but does not support answering. The honest answer to the specific interior of those final days at Lake Como is that it remains imperfectly recovered. Fact number 84. In August 1943 in Sicily, General George Patton slapped a hospitalized soldier he accused of malingering. The incident nearly ended his career. Eisenhower managed it with a private reprimand and public suppression before the story broke in the American press. Whether it reflected a specific failure of judgment in a moment of accumulated stress, or a deeper behavioral pattern the military had been managing around rather than addressing, is a question that the biographical literature on Patton has not resolved into a settled psychological portrait. The specific state of Patton's psychology in Sicily in August 1943, the accumulated weight of the campaign, the specific relationship between his public performance of aggressive confidence and the private uncertainty and self-doubt his diaries suggest was more significant than the public performance acknowledged, is recoverable in outline but not in the full interior the question requires. More broadly, the Patton case raises a question about the specific relationship between military effectiveness and the psychological traits that produce it. Were the qualities that made him an exceptionally effective commander inseparable from the qualities that produced the slapping? And did the military's management of the incident reflect an honest institutional engagement with that relationship? or a pragmatic calculation about a valuable asset that gave the moral question less consideration than it deserved. Fact number 85. Japan's primary strategic objective in late 1941 was the resource-rich European colonial possessions in Southeast Asia: oil, rubber, the materials the Japanese war machine needed. The question of why the attack on Pearl Harbor was considered necessary, rather than simply moving south without provoking the United States into war, is one the historical literature has examined through multiple frameworks without producing a consensus. The naval argument that the Pacific Fleet would have interdicted Japanese supply lines to the southern resource zone is documented in Japanese operational planning and is not without military merit. What the military assessment doesn't fully account for is the political dimension, the specific calculation about American political will that the Pearl Harbor attack required, and whether a Japanese leadership that included men with direct experience of American society and industry genuinely believed that the attack would produce the shock and restraint it was premised on producing. The subsequent events suggested that whatever political assessment underlay the Pearl Harbor decision was a catastrophic misreading of American political psychology. Whether the available evidence should have corrected that misreading before the decision was made, and why it didn't, is a question that sits at the intersection of military planning and political psychology in ways that remain genuinely unresolved. Fact number 86. Was the post-war division of Europe into Western and Soviet spheres determined primarily at the wartime conferences Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam through specific agreements among the Big Three? Or was it determined primarily by the military positions of the respective forces at Germany's surrender, with the conference agreements serving to ratify what military reality had already established? The percentage agreements between Churchill and Stalin in Moscow in October 1944, the back of the envelope division of Balkan influence scribbled on a piece of paper, illustrate the specific difficulty of reconstructing what the wartime leaders understood themselves to be committing to in their meetings. The record reflects each side's specific incentive to interpret ambiguous agreements in directions most favorable to subsequent claims. The Cold War division of Europe had causes operating at multiple levels simultaneously: the military, the diplomatic, the ideological, and the specific contribution of specific wartime decisions to the specific post-war outcome is a question that 70 years of scholarship has worked on without answering in the form the question ultimately requires. It is history's most consequential unresolved question about how the world we inhabit came to be shaped as it is. Fact number 87. Why, when the scale and purpose of the deportations became known within Jewish communities of occupied Europe, did more organized collective resistance not occur? The question has been examined by historians including Yehuda Bauer and Raoul Hilberg with the seriousness it deserves and an honesty about the limits of the available answers that the question also deserves. The explanations offered are all documented and all partial. The specific conditions of physical weakness, organizational destruction, and informational isolation in which the deportations occurred, the progressive dehumanization that systematically stripped communities of the collective resources that resistance requires, the long history of European Jewish survival through accommodation rather than armed resistance, the rational calculation that resistance would produce more immediate deaths than compliance. All of these are real. None adds up to an explanation that satisfies the full weight of the question. The honest answer, that resistance did occur in multiple places and forms, that its absence in other cases reflects conditions whose full weight only those who lived inside them could measure, is both true and insufficient. The question is ultimately about the specific conditions under which human beings can and cannot organize collective action in the face of organized destruction. It has implications that extend far beyond the specific historical case. Fact number 88. The division of Korea at the 38th parallel was created in August 1945 by a small group of American planners working overnight with a National Geographic map. The line was intended as a temporary administrative boundary separating Soviet and American occupation zones in the hours between the Japanese surrender announcement and the arrival of Allied forces on the peninsula. It became instead the boundary between two hostile states. The conflict that followed killed approximately 3 million people. The specific decision, who drew the line, why the 38th parallel rather than another, what the decision makers understood about Korean geography and Korean political dynamics, is documented in ways that establish what was decided while leaving open the broader question of whether the decision was inevitable given the circumstances, or contingent in ways that a different process might have altered. The Korean War's origins belong to the unresolved questions of the Second World War because the division that produced the conflict was itself a product of the war's final days, a temporary administrative arrangement whose permanence nobody intended and that has now lasted for 8 decades. Fact number 89. Reinhard Heydrich, the architect of the final solution, one of the most powerful and feared figures in the entire SS hierarchy, was assassinated in Prague in May 1942 at the age of 38. His death foreclosed the personal record that would have most directly illuminated what he intended for himself and for the Nazi state beyond the specific operational responsibilities he held at the time of his death. Robert Gewarth's biography, the most rigorous modern account, reconstructs Heydrich's trajectory from the documentary record with considerable skill and is honest about what the documentary record cannot provide: the full interior of a man who was simultaneously one of the most effective administrators of mass murder in modern history, and a figure whose specific personal psychology remains partly in shadow. The question of what Heydrich would have become had he lived, and the specific historical consequences that a living Heydrich might have produced in the war's subsequent course, is a counterfactual whose dimensions the available evidence can sketch but not fully populate. That its unanswerability is in this particular case among the less unpleasant features of the historical record is an observation that the full weight of his biography supports. Fact number 90. After the war ended, approximately 12 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe. Poland's borders were redrawn westward. Populations were transferred between Greece and Turkey. Entire nationalities within the Soviet Union were forcibly relocated, accused of wartime collaboration. These population movements are documented in their demographic dimensions with considerable precision. Their psychological dimensions have been documented with considerably less. What does it mean for a society to absorb, within a single generation, population movements of this scale? To integrate millions of people carrying the specific psychological legacy of violent displacement into communities that were themselves recovering from the war's other consequences. This is a question the sociological literature began to address in the post-war decades and has not completed. The specific relationship between the population transfers and the subsequent political trajectories of the receiving societies, the contribution of expellee communities to West German politics, the dynamics produced by the settlement of Jewish displaced persons in Israel, the social consequences of internal Soviet deportations for the nationalities subjected to them is a field whose scholarship continues to expand and whose fundamental questions remain, in the form that would constitute a satisfying general account, genuinely open. Fact number 91. The historical debate over whether the United States government possessed specific foreknowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack and withheld it to bring America into the war on terms Roosevelt preferred cannot be engaged with seriously without acknowledging both what the documentary record establishes and the Moonbee of 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 the documentary record establishes and the movie of the documentary record establishes the movie of the documentary record establishes what it doesn't. The record establishes clearly that American signals intelligence had broken Japanese codes and that intercepts available in the days before the attack, properly analyzed and communicated, might have produced a warning to the Hawaiian commanders. The record also establishes with equivalent clarity that the available intelligence did not constitute specific foreknowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack in the form the conspiracy theory requires. Gordon Prange's exhaustive examination reaches conclusions about intelligence failure that subsequent scholarship has largely sustained. What the evidence cannot rule out, and what the conspiracy theory exploits, is the gap between the imperfect communication of ambiguous intelligence and the deliberate withholding of specific knowledge, a gap that the nature of intelligence failures consistently makes available for conspiracy interpretation. The documentary record closes this gap more persuasively for specialists who have worked with it carefully than for the general public, for whom the question remains characteristically more open. Fact number 92. The Nuremberg trials established that certain things, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, war crimes, were matters of international law for which individuals could be held personally accountable regardless of their official position. This was a genuine contribution to international law. It was also, as critics noted immediately, applied exclusively by the victorious powers against the defeated ones. The Soviet judges represented a government that had signed a pact with Germany, invaded Poland, and conducted the Katyn massacre. American and British judges represented governments whose strategic bombing campaigns had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The charge of waging aggressive war was applied exclusively to German conduct. Whether the Nuremberg principles constitute a genuine foundation for international law, or whether they constitute victor's justice in a form that their subsequent invocation as universal principles does not adequately acknowledge, this is a question that international legal scholars have debated since 1946 without arriving at a consensus that honestly satisfies both the genuine contribution the trials made and the genuine selectivity of their application. Both things are true. The framework that reconciles them honestly has not been fully constructed. Fact number 93. In Hitler's final years, his personal physician Theodor Morell administered a remarkable combination of stimulants, sedatives, and other compounds. What effect these medications had on Hitler's decision-making capacity, and specifically whether specific pharmaceutical combinations influenced the specific decisions of the war's critical periods, is a question medical historians have examined with increasing sophistication. Leonard Heston and Renate Heston's medical analysis, and more recently Ola's Blitzed, argued for varying degrees of pharmaceutical influence on Hitler's mental state and decision-making. The counter-argument that Hitler's decisions reflected ideology and strategic conviction rather than pharmacological impairment, and that the search for a medical explanation represents a form of exculpatory reductionism, has been made by equally serious historians. What the question cannot be resolved into, given the available medical record, is a determination of the specific contribution of specific medications to specific decisions at specific moments. The causal pathway between pharmacological effect and political decision is not traceable with the precision the question requires from the surviving evidence. The medications were real. Their influence on the most consequential decisions of the 20th century remains genuinely uncertain. Fact number 94. Franco's Spain maintained trading relationships with Germany throughout the war, receiving German gold in exchange for Spanish goods and services. What happened to the Nazi-looted gold that passed through Spanish banks has been addressed by a 1998 Spanish government report and subsequent historical research, assessed as adequate by Spanish authorities and as less than complete by independent researchers. The specific question of whether the established receipt represented the full extent of Spain's transactions with looted gold, or whether the investigation's reliance on surviving documentation left unexamined transactions whose records had not survived or had not been provided, is one that researchers who have worked most carefully with the Spanish financial archives raise as genuine uncertainty rather than settled fact. The post-war financial archaeology of neutral countries that maintained economic relationships with Germany, Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, Sweden, is a field whose conclusions the available evidence constrains without completing. Each national case involves the same fundamental tension between the official accounting and the question of whether that accounting captures the full reality of what occurred. Fact number 95. How did the specific experience of living through the Holocaust alter the fundamental premises of Jewish life, Jewish theology, and the relationship between Jewish communities and the non-Jewish world in which they had lived for centuries? The subsequent decades have been working this out and have not completed the work. Elie Wiesel's engagement with the question of God after Auschwitz, Emil Fackenheim's philosophical formulation of the obligation not to grant Hitler posthumous victories by abandoning Jewish identity, and the vast literature of theological and philosophical response to the Holocaust represent sustained attempts to work out what the Holocaust means for the fundamental commitments of a tradition that the Holocaust subjected to a pressure whose full weight the tradition had not previously been required to bear. This is not a question with a documentary answer waiting in an archive. It is a question about meaning, about the relationship between human experience and the frameworks that humans use to make experience bearable. The Holocaust's challenge to those frameworks is, 80 years later, still being worked through. The honest answer to where that working through stands is that it is not finished, and that it may not be finishable in the sense of arriving at a conclusion the weight of the question would accept as adequate. Fact number 96. Whether the Allied policy of unconditional surrender, announced at Casablanca in January 1943 and maintained through the end of the war, prolonged the conflict by removing any incentive for German or Japanese leadership to seek a negotiated end, is a question military historians have examined as both a strategic and a moral question without producing an account that satisfies both dimensions simultaneously. The argument that unconditional surrender stiffened German resistance by eliminating the possibility of negotiated terms has been made by serious historians and countered by the argument that no Nazi German government would have offered terms the Allies could have accepted, making the policy not a foreclosure of a genuine alternative but a refusal to pursue a fiction. The Japanese case is more complicated. Evidence that elements of the Japanese government sought to negotiate surrender terms before the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry into the war is more substantial than the equivalent German evidence. Whether maintenance of unconditional surrender in the specific form it took with Japan, specifically the initial treatment of the Emperor's fate as negotiable, added to the war's final cost, is a question the evidence supports examining seriously without supporting a definitive answer. Fact number 97. The soldiers who survived the war came home carrying memories that their cultures had no adequate language for. The question of what a society owes the people it sends to war and damages was not seriously asked in the immediate post-war period. The psychological costs of the war were managed primarily through the silence that the culture offered and the veterans largely accepted. The question began to be asked more seriously in the context of the Vietnam War and its aftermath, which produced the diagnostic framework of PTSD, then retrospectively applied to the Second World War generation. The retrospective application has been both illuminating and problematic. Illuminating because it provides clinical language for experiences that Second World War veterans had no language for. Problematic because it imposes a contemporary diagnostic framework on experiences that occurred in a different cultural and historical context, and that the people who had those experiences understood and lived with according to frameworks that were not clinical and were not necessarily inadequate for being different. The question of what a society owes the people it damages in its wars, and whether the answer has changed between 1945 and the present in ways that reflect genuine moral progress or primarily the changing institutional interests of the psychiatric professions, is one that the history of the Second World War's psychological legacy raises and that the available scholarship has not settled. Fact number 98. What was the Second World War ultimately for? What did its full cost in human life and human suffering purchase, and was what it purchased worth what it cost? The post-war decades have answered this question differently at different points as the specific consequences of the war's outcome have changed with the passage of time. In 1945, the answer seemed clearer than it would subsequently become: the defeat of fascism, the liberation of occupied Europe, the ending of the Holocaust. By the 1950s, the emergence of the Cold War had complicated the picture as the Soviet Union, whose contribution to Allied victory had been indispensable, extended its control over the Eastern European countries whose liberation from Germany the war had ostensibly been fought to achieve. By the end of the Cold War, the picture had shifted again. It continues to shift as the institutions built on the war's ruins, the United Nations, the international human rights framework, the European project, face pressures whose ultimate outcome is not yet determined. The question of what the war was for is not a question with a fixed answer. It is a question whose answer is continuously being determined by the history that has followed it. That revision is still in progress. It is one of the war's most consequential unfinished businesses. Fact number 99. Does the Holocaust represent something genuinely unprecedented in human history? Or does it belong to a continuum of genocidal violence that includes the Armenian genocide, the Atlantic slave trade, the Belgian Congo, and the destruction of indigenous populations across colonized territories? The argument for uniqueness, made most forcefully by Elie Wiesel and Yehuda Bauer, rests on the specific combination of industrial scale, ideological totality, and geographic scope of the killing, which together produced something that the comparative study of genocide does not find precisely replicated in other cases. The argument against the uniqueness claim, made by scholars including A. Dirk Moses, rests on the observation that the claim has been used to limit the application of the Holocaust's lessons to other cases of mass violence in ways that serve particular political interests. Both arguments contain genuine insights. The tension between them is not resolvable by the historical record alone, because the question of uniqueness is ultimately philosophical and political as much as historical. The historical record provides the evidence for the argument without determining its conclusion. Both sides of the argument taken seriously illuminate something the other would prefer not to acknowledge. Fact number 100. Could the Second World War have been prevented? Not in the trivial sense of whether different decisions at specific choice points might have produced different outcomes, but in the deeper sense of whether the specific configuration of forces that produced the war was contingent, or whether something in the structure of the international system as it existed in the 1930s made a catastrophic conflict of approximately that character and approximately that scale something close to inevitable. The debate between structural explanations, locating the war's causes in the international system, the global economic crisis, the specific instabilities of the Versailles settlement, and agential explanations, locating the causes in the specific decisions of specific individuals, particularly Hitler, is a debate that 80 years of scholarship has sustained without resolution. The two types of explanation operate at different levels of analysis and are not straightforwardly commensurable. What the debate consistently returns to is the question of how much human agency matters in the face of structural forces, a question the war raised with unusual clarity and that the historical analysis of the war has been unable to answer with the precision that its moral and political weight deserves. Whether individuals make history or history makes individuals is one of the oldest questions in human thought. The Second World War poses it with unusual force and does not resolve it. Fact number 101. Among all the questions the war generated and left unanswered, the one that sits most persistently at the center of everything is the one children ask, and that adults, having studied the war for 80 years, have not found a way to answer that fully satisfies the asking. How did ordinary people do this to each other? Not the generals and ideologues. Not the men whose specific pathologies can be identified and named, but the ordinary men who shot Jewish families into pits in Lithuania, who operated the machinery at Auschwitz, who firebombed Tokyo, who conducted the Nanjing massacre, who administered the bureaucratic machinery of destruction in offices with filing systems and lunch breaks and families waiting at home. The question is not rhetorical, it is a genuine inquiry into human nature at its most disturbing, and the answers that 80 years of scholarship has accumulated, about authority and obedience, about institutional context, about ideology and peer pressure and the specific psychology of group violence, are all partial, all illuminating, and none of them final. Stanley Milgram's experiments, Philip Zimbardo's research, Christopher Browning's forensic examination of Reserve Police Battalion 101, the candid testimony of perpetrators, all contribute to an answer that remains incomplete. The question will not be answered by further research in the way factual questions are answered. It will be engaged with perpetually by each generation that encounters the evidence of what human beings did to each other between 1939 and 1945, and asks with whatever honesty they can muster what that evidence means about the species doing the asking. Every archive eventually runs out of boxes. Every generation of researchers working on the Second World War eventually finds the limit of what the surviving evidence can establish. And at that limit, the work of scholarship gives way to something else, the work of sitting honestly with what cannot be known. The questions we've explored tonight have been about that limit. They're about the specific gap between what the evidence establishes and what the questions actually require. A gap that isn't a failure of research, but an honest measurement of the distance between the record that history keeps and the full reality of what happened inside the decisions, the doubts, and the specific moral moments of the people who lived it. Some of these questions are close to being answered. Future research will narrow them further. Some are not close at all, and the passage of time, the death of witnesses, the decay of documents moves them in the opposite direction. And some are not the kind of questions that evidence can answer because they are questions about meaning and human nature, and those questions are answered, if they are answered at all, not in archives but in the continuing human effort to understand what the past reveals about the present. What tonight has tried to honor is the seriousness of not knowing. It is easy, with 80 years of scholarship and the full benefit of hindsight, to approach the Second World War with a confidence about causes and meanings and responsibilities that the people living inside it could not have had. It is harder and more honest to maintain the uncertainty that the evidence actually warrants, to say, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and the difference matters. The war ended 80 years ago. The questions it generated have not ended, and some of them will not end. They are the inheritance of everyone born into the world the war created, which is everyone alive today. The inheritance includes the institutions built on the war's ruins, the frameworks constructed to prevent its recurrence, and the specific political geography of the world we inhabit. It also includes the questions, unanswered, partially answered, unanswerable, that the war deposited in the historical record and that each generation must pick up and carry forward. Carry them carefully. They are heavier than they look. And rest now. The questions will be here tomorrow, as they have been every day since the war ended, waiting with the patience that only the genuinely important can sustain. Sleep well.